In the middle of Dustfield's sun-bleached main street stood a rusted iron cage that looked more like a relic of medieval cruelty than anything that belonged in a God-fearing Texas town. Inside it was a girl, no older than 18, her dress torn at the shoulder, her cheeks streaked with dust and tears, her back pressed against the bars like she was trying to disappear. A crude sign dangled from the front propertha. The townspeople had gathered like buzzards, some laughing, some shaking their heads, but none doing a thing to help. That was Dustfield, all right. Folks talked big on Sundays and turned coward the rest of the week. Silas dismounted boots, kicking up little clouds of red dirt as he walked toward the cage. The girl's name, someone muttered, was Lily Carter. Her father had died, owing Horace Blackwell $200, and now the loan shark meant to collect through her. Vane's kind of contract was a leash, not a piece of paper. Everyone knew what happened to girls who got purchased by him. They vanished into saloons, gambling dens, or worse, across 3 different territories. Silas reached into his vest pocket and found his old cracked billfold. Inside was exactly $23, the last of his cattle sale money. It was supposed to buy seed for winter, maybe fix the roof before the rains hit. But in that moment, looking at Mercy trembling in that iron box, Silas knew that some debts weren't about money. They were about what kind of man you were when the world demanded an answer. That girl didn't just need $1. Then Horace Blackwell showed up like a buzzard in a 3-piece suit, gold teeth, gleaming voice, slick as lamp oil. He strutted in front of that cage like he owned the ground he walked on. When Silas offered to pay the $200, Vane smiled like a man holding a loaded deck and said the price had changed. Interest, he called it. Now it was $250. A gut punch. Silas only had $23 in his pocket and the crowd knew it. He didn't hesitate. "I'll work it off," he said, jaw clenched. "Whatever it takes." The crowd hushed. Vane's grin got wider. Everyone knew what kind of work Horace Blackwell handed out to desperate men. Debt collection, intimidation, sometimes worse. But Silas didn't. That was the deal that changed everything. Silas agreed to 1 month of work in exchange for Mercy's freedom, knowing full well the price might be more than blood and bruises. Vane handed over the key like he was handing off cattle. And when Silas opened that cage, Mercy collapsed into his by the Tim. Jack Colton hadn't wanted to take another job for a man like Horace Blackwell. At 45 years old, his hands were already stained enough for a lifetime. Yet there he was standing in the dusty yard of his sagging ranch house, staring down at a girl he'd freed from an iron cage less than 24 hours earlier. Lily Carter, 18 if that, blonde hair, tangled bruises along her wrists where the iron bars had bitten deep, and eyes the color of an overcast sky. She was sitting on his porch steps, now knees pulled to her chest, holding a chipped enamel cup of coffee in both hands, like it was the last warmth left in Texas. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, cracked by fear and days of thirst. Silas said nothing at first. His gaze drifted past her to the field beyond where parched soil stretched out in every direction. A cold wind swept down off the north ridge, making the loose boards on the porch creak. The ranch was falling apart, barn roof sagging like an old mule's back, fences leaning, water barrels near empty. He'd planned to patch it all this spring with the money from his last cattle drive. Instead, that money had gone to Horace Blackwell. $23 and not a cent more. That's all he'd had in his pocket when he'd found Mercy in the cage yesterday. But Vane hadn't cared about cash. No, he wanted something else, a man with calloused hands and a name that still carried weight in certain parts of Texas. Silas had agreed to work off the rest of Mercy's debt, though every bone in his body told him it was a mistake. "Sometimes a man's got to pay for his choices," Silas said at last, his voice low and worn. "Even when they're bad ones." At sunup the next day, Silas rode into Dustfield to meet Vane. The town smelled of dust and horse sweat its main street. Little more than a strip of hard-packed dirt lined with crooked storefronts. McCready's saloon was awake, early drunks spilling out from the night before, and the blacksmith's hammer rang like a church bell somewhere off to the west. Vane was waiting in front of the sheriff's office, dressed like a peacock in a black 3-piece suit and a crimson silk cravat. His boots gleamed and a gold pocket watch dangled from his vest chain, catching the early light. He smiled as Silas approached, and the flash of those gold teeth made Silas's stomach twist. "Mr. Thorne," Vane said with mock politeness. "Punctual. I like that in a man." "I'm here," Silas replied flatly. "Oh, you're here all right." Vane stepped closer, the scent of bay rum cologne cutting through the street's stink. "And you're ready for your first assignment?" Silas didn't answer. He simply adjusted the Colt .45 at his hip and waited. Vane's grin widened. "There's an old widow on Creek Road. Ada Fletcher. Sweet lady. God-fearing, hardworking. But she's fallen behind on her loan payments. 3 months behind to be exact." Silas felt his jaw tighten. He knew Ada Fletcher. Everybody in these parts did. 70 years old, trying to work 40 acres since her husband died of consumption 2 winters back. Her grandson Thomas had ridden out from Denver recently to help her. "You want me to scare an old woman, Silas?" asked his voice like gravel. "Scare, persuade, call it what you like," Vane said with a shrug. "But understand this, if she doesn't pay by tomorrow, her farm becomes mine. And if you don't deliver my message, well, I might start asking questions about that little blonde dove you're keeping up on the ridge." Silas's fingers twitched toward his revolver, but he stopped himself. Drawing on Vane here in broad daylight with half the sheriff's deputies in Vane's pocket would just get him killed. The ride to Creek Road took nearly an hour. The Texas sun was already climbing high, burning off the last scraps of morning mist. As he rode, Silas thought about the widow, about Mercy, about Rosa Delgado, the Mexican girl he'd loved 20 years ago, but hadn't had the guts to marry. About their daughter Sophia, who died of fever at 3 years old while Silas was off chasing rustlers. By the time he reached the Patterson place, his gut felt like it had a lead weight in it. The white clapboard house looked tidy, but tired green shutters peeling fence posts, leaning like old men in a storm. Ada Fletcher stood on the porch, her gray hair pulled into a bun, hands folded neatly in front of her apron. Beside her was Thomas, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a Denver lawman's posture and sharp measuring eyes. "Mr. Thorne," Martha said. "This is unexpected." Thomas's hand hovered near his gun belt. "What brings you out this way?" Silas tipped his hat. "Business." Thomas's eyes narrowed. Vane's business. Silas didn't answer. He was tired of lies, but didn't have the luxury of the truth either. Inside, Martha served weak coffee in cracked cups. Silas sat stiffly in a wooden chair, Thomas standing over him like a hawk. "Vane says you owe him," Silas said finally. Martha's hands trembled around her cup. "It was for medicine. Laudanum for my husband's pain. He died anyway." "He says you're 3 months late," Silas said, his voice rougher than he intended. Thomas stepped forward. "That's extortion. And you're here to help him." Silas looked up, meeting Thomas's hard stare. "I'm here to warn you. Vane won't stop. You've got until tomorrow. As he stood to leave, Silas caught sight of dust rising on the horizon. 3 riders. He didn't need to guess who they were. "Get inside," he ordered. "Bolt the doors. And load your rifle, Thomas." The Pattersons obeyed, though Thomas kept one suspicious eye on Silas as he disappeared inside. Boone and 2 other men rode into the yard like wolves circling a wounded steer. Boone was tall and lean, with a scar running from his ear to his mouth. His hand rested easy on the grip of his pistol. "Thorne," Boone called out. "I hear you've been having second thoughts about working for Mr. Vane." "Maybe I have," Silas replied. "Shame," Boone said, dismounting. "Guess we'll have to settle this here." The gunfight was over in less than a minute. Silas moved first, putting a bullet through Miller's chest before the man could draw. Thomas fired from the porch, dropping Dutch where he stood. Boone went for his gun, but Silas was faster, his shot punching through Boone's shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Boone lay in the dirt, bleeding and swearing. "You're dead, Thorne. You and that little girl on your ridge. Vane's coming for both of you." Silas holstered his Colt and spat into the dust. "Let him come." As he mounted his horse to ride back, Silas knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about Mercy anymore. It wasn't even about Vane's blood money or the Patterson farm. It was about standing up at last for what he should have fought for 20 years ago. The sun hung low on the horizon as he rode hard toward the ridge. And for the first time in decades, Jack Colton felt alive. At 45 years old, he felt every mile in his bones and every regret in his heart. Years of cattle drives, bar fights, and restless wandering had left him a man hollowed out by guilt and haunted by mistakes too numerous to count. Yet as his horse's hooves struck the hard-packed earth in a steady rhythm, he sensed this ride was different. This wasn't about land or cattle or money. It was about something deeper, something he had buried long ago and now felt clawing its way back to a head. Lay the Patterson farm, a modest white clapboard house perched on 40 acres of dry soil. The shutters, once a cheerful green, had faded under years of sun and wind. Fence posts leaned crookedly, some nearly giving way, and the barn roof sagged under the weight of too many storms. Yet the place still bore the signs of care: windows kept clean, a small vegetable patch tilled by a woman too stubborn to give up what little she had left. Ada Fletcher, widowed and 70 years old, had fought to keep this land alive since her husband's death. She wasn't weak, but she was outmatched by the corps Silas had been sent here to collect on that debt, or failing that, to make sure Martha understood what it meant to defy a man like Horace Blackwell. It wasn't the first time Silas had been asked to do a job like this, but something about this one felt different. 2 days earlier, Silas had stood in the middle of Dustfield's main street, staring at a rusted iron cage that sat like a monument to cruelty. Inside it, a girl no older than 18 huddled with her back pressed against the bars, her dress torn, her face streaked with dust and tears. A sign hung from the cage property of Horace Blackwell. Debt unpaid T. Lily Carter. Had those same eyes, the ones he never got to see in his little girl, and Silas couldn't walk away. He had emptied his billfold of every last dollar, but it hadn't been enough. Vane had agreed to release the girl on the condition that Silas worked off the rest of the debt. It was a bargain. Silas knew he might not survive, but some debts weren't about money. They were about the kind of man a P. Now riding into the Patterson yard, Silas felt the weight of another choice pressing on him. The widow didn't deserve what Vane intended. And yet, if Silas defied his orders, he knew the cost would not fall on him alone. Mercy, waiting at his ranch up on the ridge, was still vulnerable. Vane had made it clear she would pay the price for Silas's defiance. As he sat there, horse shifting beneath him, he heard the distant sound of hooves and saw a rising cloud of dust. 3 riders were closing in, their figures growing sharper against the morning light. Vane's men had come to make sure Silas followed through. Boone led the group, a tall, wiry man with a scar carved from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He carried himself with the cold confidence of a man who'd killed more times than he could count. Flanking him were 2 others, both armed. Both with that hard-eyed look of men hired to do what decent folks. Silas felt the familiar stillness settle over him, the kind that came just before trouble broke loose. His hand brushed the worn grip of the Colt .45 at his hip, fingers curling around the leather like it was part of him. He had seen this dance before and knew how quickly it could. The riders pulled up in the yard, their horses snorting and stamping at the scent of tension. The choice. The first shot broke the silence like glass shattering. Silas moved faster than thought, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. One of Vane's men crumpled where he stood, his pistol still half drawn. A second shot cracked from the farmhouse, and the other man fell from his horse, clutching his chest. Boone went for his gun, but Silas's bullet punched through his should. Dust and gun smoke hung in the air, sharp in Silas's nostrils. Boone lay in the dirt, cursing, his shirt darkening with blood. Silas knew it wasn't over. Vane wouldn't let this insult pass unanswered. The widow's farm might be. Turning his horse toward the ridge, Silas spurted hard, riding for home. Each hoofbeat echoed like a drum in his skull. He thought of Mercy alone in his cabin, probably clutching the old Winchester he'd lay. As he crested the final hill, the ranch came into view. Relief surged through him at the sight of Mercy standing on the porch, rifle steady in her arms. 2 bodies lay near the barn, and a third man sat wounded on the steps, hands raised in surrender. Somehow the girl he had, but even a they. The air felt heavier that evening, as if the land itself knew what was coming. Jack Colton stood in the yard of his ranch, the boards of the porch creaking under his boots, as he watched the sun sink behind the jagged ridge to the west. The Texas sky blazed red and orange, streaked with thin black clouds that seemed to echo the turmoil churning inside him. It had been years since he had felt this still, this focused. The sound of wind rushing through the dry grass was joined by the distant thud of horse hooves, faint but steady. Horace Blackwell was on his way, bringing every hired gun and desperate man he could muster. This was the hour Silas had known would come, and there was no more time to run. The ranch had never been much to look at. A single-story cabin with a sagging roof, a barn patched with scrap lumber and fences that leaned under the weight of time. But to Silas, it had been enough quiet, lonely a place to let the years slip by like sand through a clenched fist. Now it felt like a fortress, though not one likely to hold against what was coming. Lily Carter was inside, moving with quiet determination as she checked the rifle and gathered what few supplies could matter. The girl had already proven herself, taking down 2 of Vane's men when they came sniffing around earlier in the day. She had stood her ground with a steadiness that reminded Silas of everything he admired and regretted in equal measure. Mercy was barely 18, but she carried a strength born of hardship, and Silas had come to see her as the daughter he had failed so long ago. His memories clawed at him as he loaded rounds into his Colt .45, the click of metal against metal sharp in the fading light. 20 years earlier, he had walked away from Rosa Delgado and their infant daughter Sophia. He had told himself it was because a drifting ranch hand had no business raising a family. He had told himself he would come back once he was ready. But life doesn't wait for a man to grow into his courage, and by the time he returned, both mother and child were gone. Sophia's grave, marked only with a wooden cross, still haunted him more than any ghost. Horace Blackwell had found that wound and pressed on it like a knife. The man hadn't been satisfied with money or obedience. He wanted to own Silas in the same way he owned half the town of Dustfield. When Silas had refused to intimidate the widow Ada Fletcher, and her grandson Thomas Vane had sent his dogs to remind him who held the leash, Silas had killed 2 of them and left a third wounded on his own porch. That decision had sealed his fate. Vane wasn't just coming for Mercy or the ranch. He was coming to make an example of a man who dared to say no. The sound of hooves grew louder now, and Silas stepped down from the porch, feeling the loose dirt shift under his boots. Dust rose on the horizon, a dark smear against the dying light. There were too many riders to count, but he guessed 15 or more, and at the center of them would be Vane himself. The man would arrive dressed like a banker and armed like a general, confident that no one could challenge his reign of fear. But Silas had nothing left to lose. Not his reputation, which had rotted long ago. Not his land, which was little more than dry soil and broken fences. He had only Mercy and the chance, however, slim, to give her the freedom he had denied his own child. From the east came another sound, faint at first, then growing a sharper cadence of hooves. Silas turned and saw another group of riders emerging from the trees beyond the creek. There were fewer of them, but they rode in tight formation, rifles slung across their chests. At their head was Daniel Monroe, wearing the star of a deputy federal marshal. Against all odds, Thomas had sent for help, and it had arrived in time. The two groups converged in the open space in front of the ranch, the ground trembling under the weight of horses and men. Vane's riders fanned out in a wide semicircle, weapons drawn and faces hard. The marshal's men formed a line, their horses standing steady despite the tension in the air. Silas could feel the moment stretching, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The silence shattered with a single gunshot. No one knew who fired first, but within seconds the yard erupted in chaos. Gunfire cracked like thunder, the acrid smell of black powder filling the air. Silas moved on instinct, firing from behind the water trough, his aim steady despite the adrenaline pounding in his veins. Men fell from saddles, horses screamed, and the dust turned red where it settled over the dead and dying. Vane's men, caught between the ranch and the marshal's deputies, found themselves trapped in a deadly crossfire. Silas saw one rider break for the tree line, only to be cut down by a rifle shot from Daniel Monroe. Through the haze of smoke, Silas caught sight of Vane himself, still in the saddle, his fine coat spattered with dust. The man was trying to wheel his horse away, but Thomas's rifle barked and Vane toppled to the ground. The fight was over as suddenly as it had begun. The surviving outlaws dropped their weapons and raised their hands, faces pale with fear. The marshal's men moved in, gathering up the wounded and disarming those still able to stand. Silas crossed the yard, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust, and found Vane lying behind the water trough. Blood soaked through his shirt, and the gold teeth that once gleamed in triumph now glinted dully in the dirt. The man who had ruled through fear and cruelty was gasping like a beached fish, his life draining out with every breath. For years, Silas had imagined what he would feel if he ever saw justice done to a man like Vane. He thought he might feel triumph or peace, but as he looked down at the dying man, he felt nothing but emptiness. The sun was gone now, leaving only the pale glow of a crescent moon and the crackle of a dying fire near the barn. The bodies had been counted and the wounded tended. The marshal's men were already preparing to ride back to Dustfield with their prisoners. Mercy stepped out of the cabin, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale but resolute. She had survived, but Silas knew she would carry scars from this day, just as he had carried his own for decades. He turned and looked at the road stretching westward, vanishing into the darkness. The ranch had been his prison as much as it had been his refuge. Now it felt like nothing more than ashes. It was time to leave Texas behind. The first light of dawn stretched across the Texas plains, painting the sky in muted shades of gray and gold. Jack Colton stood in the doorway of his cabin, the cool morning air heavy with the scent of dew-soaked earth and wood smoke from the dying embers of last night's fire. Behind him, the small room was quiet, except for the soft sound of Lily Carter breathing as she slept beneath a patchwork quilt. For years, this place had been his refuge, a prison of solitude, where he tried to outlast the memories that haunted him. Now it felt like a hollow shell, as if all the meaning had been drained from it in the space of a single bloody night. The yard bore the scars of the battle that had ended Horace Blackwell's reign of terror. Spent shell casings glinted in the dirt, and dark stains marked where men had fallen and bled into the dust. The water trough, once a resting place for tired hands and thirsty horses, was pocked with bullet holes. The fences leaned worse than ever, broken in places where frightened horses had charged through. Silas's ranch, such as it was, had survived the fight but felt stripped of any peace it had once offered. 2 days had passed since Vane's death, and still Silas felt no triumph. Watching the man gasp his last breath in the dirt had not brought the closure he had imagined during years of restless nights. Justice had come but too late to erase the weight of his past. Rosa Delgado and their daughter Sophia remained in their graves, beyond the reach of vengeance or redemption. What lingered in Silas's chest now was not satisfaction, but the deep, aching weariness of a man who had spent too long carrying burdens he could not set down. Mercy stirred within the cabin. The faint creak of floorboards followed as she rose and moved about, gathering what little they could take with them. She had been quiet since the fight, her strength unbroken, but her eyes distant. The girl had shown remarkable courage, standing her ground against Vane's men when all seemed lost. Yet, Silas knew the cost of such bravery. He had seen it before in soldiers, ranch hands, and lawmen, the way courage could calcify into scars that never truly faded. They would leave Texas today. There was no future here, not for either of them. Dustfield would recover in time, but it would always be a place soaked in the memory of what had been done and what had been lost. The townsfolk would whisper Silas's name in equal parts gratitude and fear. Some would call him a hero for breaking Vane's hold on the territory. Others a killer whose hands were too stained to ever be clean. Silas cared little for their opinions. His only concern now was mercy and the life they might build beyond these sun-baked hills. The wagon waited in the yard, its wooden sides weathered and cracked. A single mule, lean but steady, had been hitched to it. Mercy had packed it carefully, what little food they had, a few tools, and the battered rifle that had become their lifeline. They owned no fine things, no keepsakes save for an old photograph Silas kept tucked in his breast pocket. It was of Elena, barely 16, when it was taken holding a dark-haired baby swaddled in a blanket. The photograph was worn soft from years of handling, the faces fading but never gone. Silas stepped into the cabin and found Mercy folding the last of her clothes into a small bundle. The morning light caught her hair, turning it into a pale halo that made her seem older than her 18 years. She had grown in ways Silas had not expected. Her fear had not broken her but hardened into quiet resolve. She moved with a calmness that belied the horrors she had endured, as if surviving Vane's cruelty had forged her into something stronger. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. Silas crouched and stirred it back to life long enough to heat a kettle of coffee. The familiar routine soothed him, though the weight in his chest remained. He thought of the road ahead, of the miles they would travel in search of a place where no one knew his name or hers. Colorado territory called to him, its wild hills and open spaces, promising a kind of freedom Texas no longer held. By mid-morning they were ready to leave. Silas helped Mercy climb into the wagon, her boots scuffing against the wooden step. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could already see the life waiting for them beyond it. Silas took one last look at the ranch house, the sagging porch, the patched roof, the faint smoke curling from the chimney. This place had been both sanctuary and prison, and now he would leave it behind with no promise of return. The mule stepped forward at Silas's soft command hooves, crunching over the dry earth as the wagon rolled onto the narrow track leading north. The road was rough, rutted by years of wagon wheels and rain, but it stretched on, endlessly winding through mesquite scrub and prairie grass. Silas felt the pull of it deep in his bones. He had spent his whole life running from mistakes, from responsibility, from himself. But this was different. This wasn't a flight from danger. It was a journey toward something he had almost forgotten how to believe in: hope. The sky was wide and clear, the sun already warming the land despite the early hour. A breeze stirred the tall grass, carrying with it the smell of sage and the faint promise of rain. For the first time in years, Silas felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly. He didn't know what awaited them in Colorado, or whether they could ever truly outrun the shadows of the past. But with each mile that passed under the wagon wheels, the weight of old ghosts seemed to grow lighter. Behind them, Texas faded into memory. Ahead lay a future neither of them could yet define, but one they would build together. Silas glanced at Mercy, her face calm but alert, and felt a flicker of something he thought had died with Sophia. It wasn't joy exactly, nor was it peace. It was the fragile beginning of purpose, like the first green shoot breaking through parched soil after a long drought. The road would be long. There would be more hardships to face, more miles to endure. But as the sun climbed higher and the wagon rolled on, Jack Colton realized that for the first time in 20 years he wasn't riding away from something. He was riding toward it. As we grow older, life often weighs heavy with the memories of choices made and chances missed. Jack Colton's story reminds us that even when burdened by regret, it is never too late to stand for what is right. His journey teaches that redemption is not found in grand gestures, but in the quiet courage to act when it matters most. Though haunted by the daughter he failed to protect decades ago, Silas found purpose again by saving Mercy, a young woman caught in a cruel world. For those of us looking back over long years, this is a powerful truth. We may not be able to change the past, but we can still shape the present and leave behind a better legacy. The tale also speaks to the value of compassion and standing up to injustice even when the cost is high. In a world where many turn a blind eye, being the one person who takes a stand can make all the difference. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that no matter our age, there is still a road ahead. As long as we draw breath, we have the power to make choices that heal old wounds and plant seeds of hope for tomorrow.